5 years on from the Arab Spring, has it transformed North Africa and the Middle East? And why do so many now look back on it as a failure? Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Just over 5 years ago, waves of unrest erupted across North Africa and the Middle East. The so-called Arab Spring began in Tunisia, and soon mass protests, like those in Cairo's Tahrir Square, spread across the region. The revolt led to the fall of long-time leaders: President Mubarak of Egypt, Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, President Ben Ali of Tunisia, and President Saleh of Yemen. The uprisings promised much, but some of the countries that experienced Arab Spring protests, like Syria and Yemen, are now mired in war. We begin with CCTV correspondent Yasser Hakim, who joins us from Egypt, Cairo. Yasser, you're in Cairo, which was, of course, a major part of the Arab Spring uprising playing out. Hundreds killed, the fall of the President Hosni Mubarak, then the ouster of his successor, Mohamed Morsi. How is the Arab Spring being viewed there 5 years on, sir?
Well, Nathan, the problem is that the Arab Spring, when it happened, the expectations were very high, but there's now kind of a mix between the people here, whether it's been a success or not. If you look at the political side, the elections and political activities are much open now than before during the Mubarak era, or before Mubarak as well, and also there's a lot of media attention, media freedom, if you compare it to before. But one thing that has marred this is the economy. The Egyptians and most of the people in the region have suffered economically very much after the Arab Springs, because of the political unrest, because of the violence. And therefore there's no tourism as before, there's no revenues, people have lost a lot of jobs. And this is, the Arab Spring was part of it to get a better living, and this has not happened. And this is why people see it that maybe it's not such a success as hoped or expected when it happened.
Yeah, some people are talking economically about an Arab winter, aren't they? Is there any country in the region that you think the Arab Spring is considered to have been a success?
Well, certainly not Libya, but if you look at Tunisia, many Egyptians see Tunisia as maybe the one with the least losses, if you can call especially loss of lives or violence. It has not been as troubled as in Egypt. You had two uprisings, two presidents being ousted in the last 3 years, and that has pushed the country back a while. But many Egyptians see the current situation in Egypt as much more stable than the last 5 years at now, and the outlook is much better. But all in all, Tunisia is seen as the more successful story than the rest of the Arab Spring.
Yasser Hakim in Cairo, thanks so much for that. And joining me now from Oxford is Tariq Ramadan. He is Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at Oxford University, and he's the grandson of Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Welcome to the show, Professor. First question, from Tunis to Tahrir Square, we are still seeing the effects of the so-called Arab Spring. Where are we in that process, and what unleashed it?
Look, I was quite critical at the very beginning, and I said just when things were happening, I'm cautiously optimistic, because I thought that we were too quick to say it's a revolution, things are going to change. If you know the story and the history of Egypt, you know how powerful was and remained the army in the country. So where we are now, it's a state of regression. There is no freedom. It's again the dictatorship where people have been put in jail. I was very critical with the Muslim Brotherhood in power and running, and I wrote a book about this, saying how much they had to reassess their political vision and dealing with education, the economic stability. But we cannot accept that because we were critical, at the end there is a coup and there is no freedom. They are in jail, and the people are suffering from the lack of liberty, the lack of dignity, and poverty and corruption is still the situation in Egypt today.
What forces were unleashed? Because in the Western media, for example, you saw lots of sort of liberal activists in, for example, Egypt in Tahrir Square, but also the Muslim Brotherhood, very much part of the uprising in Tahrir Square. I was actually there and impressed by their amazing organizational skills. So were there competing forces that are still trying to work themselves out in the region?
You know, at the beginning, it was quite clear from all the liberal forces, the secular forces, and the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamists, even the literalists and the Salafi were there. There was one target and one objective. They were all against the dictator. The problem is that the power of this united front at the beginning became a weakness just after, because then the Muslim Brotherhood, who came very late in the process, at the beginning they were not involved in all the uprising, and it were coming from, you know, the people of the organization of the 12th April and the 6th April, sorry, and also other organizations, secular organization, young people on the ground. And then at the end, with the elections, what we saw is that there was a vision against the dictator, but not a vision for the future of Egypt. And then there were competing forces. What we should avoid saying today is that the only people who are against the dictator or against the regime are not only the Muslim Brotherhood, and what happened in Rabaa, for example, are not only the Muslim Brotherhood. I think we should be very much aware that some of the people, liberals and secular, are in jail today, and all the people who were within the movement at the beginning, some of the leaders are in jail, and they are tortured, and there is no freedom. So it's not only a polarization between the army in power and the Muslim Brotherhood, it's also the civil society that is suffering, and many leaders are just now struggling against the dictatorship.
Most say, with perhaps the exception of Tunisia, from sort of Libya to the Levant, these forces haven't been able to deliver on the promise of the Arab Spring. In your view, apart from the reaction by what you've called the deep state in Egypt, regionally, was there a lack of, for example, institutions and stability and processes by which this could have developed into meaningful reform?
Yes, I think that we have to look at the civil society, and we have also to blame. It's very important to blame the dictatorships and to blame what is happening, but it's very important to be critical about the forces that were involved in removing the dictators, because they were powerful against. But as I said, what is the political vision? And you cannot, and even in Tunisia, because today we say, okay, there was no violence in Tunisia, but what is the situation in Tunisia? The coming back of more security. Again, we have a problem because of the terrorist attacks. It's not a success so far. We have to wait for that. But what I would like to see in the civil society, in the Arab societies, and it's true in Libya as it is true in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Egypt, it's something that has to do with going beyond the polarization between the secular forces and the Islamist forces. We need to deal with politics now. What is the educational strategy? What is the economic strategy? What is the way and in which way they want to deal with corruption? We have a very simplistic, superficial and dangerous polarization between two political forces, but at the end, when you question their political project, their political vision, you see that there is not so much here that you can build with. And at the end, the dictators are playing with the divisions, and the corrupt regime or the armies are playing with this, and the situation is not moving. So we cannot only blame the West for that or blame the dictators. We also have to deal with intellectuals and civil societies and institutions that are not there and not. Of course, it's very difficult when there is no freedom. But when the uprisings came, we would have expected something like this to happen, and it didn't happen.
I'm glad you brought up the Western intervention aspect, because some outsiders have seen and insiders have seen the Western response when it came to Egypt as very muddled, finally dumping Hosni Mubarak and then backing elections and then moving against the Muslim Brotherhood when they were ousted. In Libya, for example, a humanitarian intervention which led to the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi, but of course then very little follow-up in terms of nation building, and we see the situation today, almost a split state. Where does Western intervention play into the hopes and then perhaps the dashing of hopes in the Arab Spring?
Yeah, the point here is that, as I said, you know, it's a co-responsibility. It's not only coming from within. It's true that just before the Arab Spring, it's normal to question how and why, for example, Western forces or powers were supporting the dictators Ben Ali in Tunisia, or even they were quite silent and bringing back Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and dealing with Mubarak. And then after what happened in the coup in Egypt, being quite quick to accept the situation and to deal with the dictator. So we should blame the civil society, but we cannot just avoid saying and analyzing the situation, say, if you really care about freedom, if you really care about democracy, you should be consistent with the governments you are dealing with. And it has to do in many levels. If we are serious about democracy, we should be serious about some of the trends and the ideologies that we have in the Gulf states. We also have to deal with the army and not supporting the army, because the question in the Middle East is not only about stability to protect our geostrategic interests and our economic interests when it comes to Western power. It has to do with the dignity of the people. And I think that we cannot deny and we cannot avoid saying now that the response coming from the West, it's not enough when it comes to supporting democratic process and sometimes being silent when people are killed. I was the one who was saying from the very beginning, you should not be silent when people are killed in Syria. I also is one of those who was saying we have to be very cautious and say that what is happening today in Yemen, it's very dangerous with all the civilians being killed. So I would like more consistency with our the Western foreign policies.
But it's also regional, isn't it? You know, the hopes and dreams of the Arab Spring, some have been hijacked by regional interests. One only has to look at what happened in Syria, and we see a regional divide in proxy support in the region in the civil war, and a similar case in Yemen. Has the Arab Spring dreams been sacrificed on regional security interests?
Oh yes, I think that we cannot just if we witness and we look at what is happening now for the sake of geostrategic interests, very often we let things happen and even people killing each other. You know, it's very cynical, and I would say that once again, I always say this. I'm not happy with the Western policies there coming from the state and coming from Europe, but I'm also very critical with the Arab countries and the Middle Eastern countries and even the scholars or the intellectuals or the people who are, or even the media who are not doing the job, and we keep on playing the victims, where at one point it's also something that has to come from within, because at the end the divide, for example, between Sunni and Shi'i is something which is now played on and multiplied in a way which is not acceptable. We are all Muslims, and we cannot just come to these types of very dangerous divisions that are not helping us to deal with the priority issues that we have to deal with. It has to do with freedom, it has to do with no corruption, it has to do with human dignity, and it has to do with justice in the region.
Tariq Ramadan, where do we go from here then? Because the forces unleashed by the so-called Arab Spring are still with us. We have a very young population in many of these regions who are connected to the world in very different ways from their parents and grandparents. The literature rates are high. Women are starting to have careers and not get married as early. Yet there's the appeal on one side of secular liberalism, but also on the other side of groups like ISIL. Where are we going with this?
I think it's very difficult. I cannot predict. I think it will take time. It will take 10 years, 20 years to start again a process where what we should expect and what we should hope is for the young generations now to understand something which is important. You know, when I wrote the book, The Arab Awakening, I was saying it might not be revolutions, but at least something change, which is this awareness that we can change history. We can make history. So what we should and hope is for young generations to come with more mobilization, more involvement in social activism, and to try to have this civil society again and to resist any type of corruption and to come together. More unity, more education, more social involvement. But to tell you the truth, I don't see this happening now. If you look at Egypt, with I don't know how many thousand people are in jail for political reasons and they have done nothing, and there is torture and corruption and dictatorship. You see at the disorder that we have in Yemen, you see what is happening in Iraq, and add to this the violence factor with the so-called Islamic State, Daesh, that are people who are in the name of Islam are criminals, and we have not only to condemn, but we have to combat them. And then if you look at all this, unfortunately, we cannot see but a destabilized Middle East for years now, and some making money out of this chaotic reality in the region.
Professor Tariq Ramadan, Arab Spring or Arab Winter, thank you so much. We'll take a short break. And when we come back, I'll talk with two more experts on the Arab Spring. Please stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to the show. Just over 5 years on from the Arab Spring, we are talking about its impact on the Middle East and North Africa. Joining me now from London is Abdel-Bari Atwan. He is editor-in-chief of the Arab opinion website Rai Al-Yum, and he's the founder and former editor of Al-Quds Al-Arabi newspaper. And with me here also in the studio is Sahar Khamis. She's an expert on Arab media, and she's an associate professor of communication at the University of Maryland. Welcome both to the show. Let's start with you in London, Abdel-Bari. Arab Spring, 5 years on. Lots to report, but let's step back. What caused the Arab Spring, and why did it spread so quickly?
Well, actually, yes, many people in the Middle East hoping that it will be a spring, but you know, the outcome is disastrous. Now we have more than 5 failed states, military intervention, civil wars, and the oil revenues evaporated in arms deals and in wars, you know, in Yemen and Syria. So it is a disaster, to be honest. Personally, I was one of the optimistic people that this spring actually could change the Middle East to the better. But the outcome is, you know, it's for the worse, and that's what happened. And the picture is very, very grim now, and people are really frustrated. More than 300,000 people killed in Syria. The same thing, similar thing happened in Libya. Now there will be another intervention by NATO in Libya to fix the first intervention or the outcome of the first intervention 5 years ago. So, okay, maybe we get rid of dictators, certain dictators, but we also get rid of the stability of the region.
Instability, Sahar Khamis. Lots of people talking about an Arab winter now after the Arab Spring. How do we get to this point? Because, as we've said, there was so much hope and optimism at the beginning.
Yeah, there's a saying that says, you know, that it's always easier to get rid of a dictator than to figure out what to do next. And that's exactly what happened in the Arab Spring movements, unfortunately. There was a lot of optimism, a lot of enthusiasm, and even euphoria at the beginning. And we were all so excited. You know, I'm a citizen of Egypt. I was so excited about the Egyptian revolution, you know, naturally in 2011, and about the Arab awakening movements in general, hoping that will bring a lot of stability and security and prosperity to the region. And unfortunately, like the other guest just mentioned, things went the wrong way, in the wrong direction. And I think a big part of that is because there was no clear script or scenario of what could possibly happen next. There's no strong NGO organizations, no strong civil society, and no strong opposition movements. That meant that you have a power vacuum. It means that you have dictators ousted from office, but you don't have a real replacement or substitute of who can possibly effectively fill in for them.
Or full disclosure, I was actually in Egypt during the revolution and actually was in Libya as well. And I want to pick up on a point you just made with Abdel-Bari about Libya. Sahar Khamis basically said the lack of institutions across the region, the rule of law, stability, created this vacuum. You've been very critical of the West's intervention in Libya, Abdel-Bari. Is that what you saw in that example?
Yes, I was critical simply because I know, this kind of intervention, military intervention by NATO, it will make things worse. Because if we have a very, very bad experience in the Arab world. Whenever there is a Western intervention, military intervention on our part of the world, it does create a failed states. And this failed state is the better environment, the best incubator for radical organization like Al-Qaeda, like the Islamic State. So, and also it will be a springboard for illegal immigrants to go to the other side of the Mediterranean, to Europe, and create a lot of problems. So when I was opposing it, I knew that the American, okay, they can intervene, they can change regimes, but they don't have plan B. So imagine NATO's countries, which is about 28 of the most sophisticated, most advanced countries on earth. They could not actually create the alternative model for the Libyan people and for the Arab world, the way actually they did in Iraq. So this is the problem we are facing now. Okay, they changed the regime and they left. Why they did not actually establish a strong army? Why they did not establish a proper security forces? Why they did not actually create a proper government? So why they did not wait until this kind of institution is rebuilt again, to have independent judicial system, to have freedom of expression, to have proper security to the whole country, to keep the country intact? But they changed the regime and they left. The same thing in Iraq. They occupied Iraq and then they left.
Right.
And we can see what's happening. Now the Syria is the same. We have a congestion of warplanes on the Syrian airspace, and nobody can tell what will happen. The Russians are there, the British are there, the French are there, the American are there, the Saudi are there, and it is endless. So we cannot tell who is there. Nobody is left not intervening in Syria. Is this the Arab Spring?
To me, that is an explanation of part of the problem, but not the entire problem.
Because, of course, you have Western intervention, there's
Yes.
lots of criticism of that,
Yes.
but also the societies themselves had to be
Absolutely.
responsible.
Thank you so much. That's exactly what I want to say. It's a partial explanation, but not a full explanation, because
Right.
Western intervention, military intervention, yes, of course, it does play a big part in this whole scenario that we are witnessing now and the disappointment we are seeing in the region, but we cannot hold it accountable for everything that went wrong.
So what-
Definitely, issues of like building and rebuilding civil society institutions, strengthening the youth movements, opposition movements from within societies themselves. Societies have to find their own mechanisms, their own recipe, if you will, for success and for reinventing themselves in a successful way. And that cannot be totally and entirely blamed just on the West. There is a responsibility for these societies internally to rebuild and reinvent themselves and to find good scenarios to substitute and to fill in for ousted governments and dictators.
Let's take the example of Egypt, Sahar, because the Muslim Brotherhood, obviously a very well-organized organization, propelled into power by the ballot box after that revolution, but then criticized so much for what they did. Does that play into the scenario that you're talking about?
Well, I think that they made a fatal mistake by really, nominating a president for office when they said they're not going to nominate a president. And then if they really stayed as a strong opposition movement, things would have been much better for them and also for the country as a whole. The fact that they took power when they were not prepared for it, Morsi was a kind-hearted, well-intentioned person. He was not necessarily a very strong leader or well prepared to lead Egypt at this stage. However, having said that, ousting him from office by military, intervention and, taking over again the government through the military is not the answer or the solution either. In fact, it did much more harm than good, and it threw off the country, I say decades back in terms of human rights and in terms of democracy and in terms of the path to democratization and reform. So the whole scenario shows what I'm talking about, the power vacuum, that you don't have clear institutions or organizations that can fill this power vacuum. So you are left with two players in the case of Egypt, the military and the Muslim Brotherhood. In my view, neither of them is well equipped to rule.
What about stability argument, Abdel-Bari? Because, for example, Bahrain was another country, but then you look at Yemen. Is stability trumping the idea of reform in the Middle East post-Arab Spring?
Well, actually, you cannot have reforms if you don't have stability in any country in the world, not only in the Arab world. And you can see this kind of instability actually blocked any kind of reforms, whether democratic reforms or economic reforms. This is the problem we are facing now in the Middle East. And also the other problem is, which is created by the Arab Spring in a way or another, and by the military intervention also, is the sectarian division. If you look at the Bahrain, for example, there is a huge sectarian division. If you look at Saudi Arabia, there is a huge sectarian division. In Syria, the same thing. In Iraq, the same thing. Who created this? You know, created this simply because it is first the military intervention. Second, actually nobody was aware of this kind of a problem which we are facing now, and it could create sectarian wars. So now, in the past, we were looking for democracy, for freedoms, for stability. Now, you know, we are on the edge of a sectarian war.
Abdul Bari, in hindsight, then, do you think in a country like Libya would be better off with Muammar Gaddafi than it is today?
Well, actually, after we've seen what happened in Libya, the destruction, the militias who are controlling everything, the Islamic State, which is setting actually bases in Sirte, Emirates in Sirte, and also in Derna, and also in the south. So when we see that, I believe, okay, Muammar al-Gaddafi could be much better. And I met a lot of Libyans who were against the revolution, who were against Gaddafi. And they are saying we are longing to Saddam Hussein and his time. And also, Iyad Allawi, one of the, you know, opposer to Saddam Hussein, just a week ago, he said, you know, the Iraqi people are longing to the time of Saddam Hussein, where Iraq was Iraq, stability was there, people coexisting. So if we actually started to put pressure on this regime to reform gradually, step by step, and not actually intervening by military power to change them, and then leave the country in a huge anarchy, a bloody anarchy, you know, if you ask me now, I will say no. I prefer, you know, to have a dictator than that bloody anarchy, which is costing us a lot of innocent lives in Libya, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, everywhere.
Abdul Bari, I just want to bring in Sahar Khamis here.
Unfortunately, that is very dangerous, because this mindset of like, you know, we were better off when Mubarak was in office. Mubarak was a dictator for 30 years ruling Egypt, and we had the revolution in 2011 to get rid of corruption and violations of human rights. And the point that people are now saying things like, oh, it would have been better had we had, you know, Mubarak in office, or Saddam Hussein, or Gaddafi. That means that, you know, we are not really able to put in the clear path to democratization and reform which needs to be scripted, and rather we are, you know, looking back to the dictators that we wanted to initially get rid of in 2011, and that's why we had the Arab Spring movements in the first place. So this mindset, unfortunately, is starting to be very widespread in the region, and to me, that is an alarming sign, because rather than saying what went wrong, you know, what were the mistakes done, how can we possibly overcome them or avoid them in the future, we are now looking back and saying, oh, the days of Mubarak, despite his dictatorship, were better off than what we have now, the days of Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi and so on. So, you know, basically to me, we should not compare, we should not say that was better. We should say that was a bad chapter. Now we have a worse chapter, but what can we do in order to get back on the right track to democratization and reform, and to rebuild these societies internally, you know, with their own resources, not really looking always to the West for answers and solutions, but trying to also find our own mechanisms for salvation and for reinventing our societies successfully and democratically from within.
Sahar Khamis here in the studio. Thank you very much, and that's all we have time for. Abdul Bari Atwan in London, really appreciate it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. We'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook, CCTV America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.